A hook that grabs the heart and doesn't let go. Before we begin, take a breath, because this story will test something inside you. It will remind you of a truth many try to forget. In America, the wrong skin color on the wrong porch can become a death sentence, even if it's your own home. Imagine this. You return to the house you grew up in, the porch where your mother used to sit, the hallway where your father hung family pictures, the only place that ever truly felt safe. And before you can step through the door, police slam you against your own wall, call you a trespasser, and drag you away in handcuffs. Not because of what you did, but because of who you are. They don't ask your name. They don't care about your story. They don't listen. They just see a black man standing somewhere they decided he shouldn't be. But here's the twist they never saw coming. The man they brutalized wasn't powerless. He was the director of the FBI. And what they unleashed would shake an entire town and expose a darkness decades deep. What follows is a story of corruption hidden behind small-town smiles. A story of stolen homes, forged documents, violent intimidation. A story where neighbors rise, families fight back, and truth becomes a weapon stronger than fear. And at its heart, it's a story about America, about the wounds we carry, the injustice we still face, and the strength we find when everyday people refuse to bow their heads. If you're ready for a story that will make your chest tighten, make your heart race, make you angry, hopeful, and proud all at once. If you're ready to witness what it truly means to stand against racism and fight for community, then lean in, listen closely, and don't look away, because every second of what you're about to hear matters. Before we start, hit subscribe to the Racial Truth YouTube channel. These stories are powerful, they're necessary, and we share them because every voice deserves to be heard. Subscribe, stay with us, and let this story change you. Now, let's begin. Home isn't home anymore. The road into Riverbend, Georgia, was narrower than Dr. Daniel Carter remembered, curling through pines and tall grass like a tired memory reluctant to be revisited. Even after decades away, the land held a familiar scent. Warm earth, magnolia blossoms, and the faint trace of pollen that always clung to the summer air. But mixed with it now was something bitter, something he couldn't name, something he felt before he fully understood. When he parked in front of his childhood home, he didn't get out right away. He sat behind the wheel, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, staring at the house that looked both exactly as it had lived in his mind and nothing like it at all. The paint was once ivory bright and clean. Now it sagged in strips like wounded skin. The porch rails leaned ever so slightly, and the front steps, once the gathering place of neighbors, cousins, and cousins of cousins, seemed smaller, as though time had eroded their confidence. Daniel exhaled, slow and deliberate. He had seen war zones. He had stood in the command center during national emergencies. He had briefed presidents and counseled world leaders. But stepping out of the car in front of this house, this fragile echo of the life that shaped him, made his chest tighten in a way no crisis ever had. He opened the door and stepped onto the gravel, the crunch beneath his polished shoes startling him with its harshness. His brown trench coat fluttered in the breeze, an odd garment for a southern summer morning. But it was his armor, the one consistent thing in a world that often shifted under his feet. It reminded him of who he had become, even when he walked into the places that remembered him only as who he was. He stood before the house and whispered, "Home." But the word felt too light, too fragile for what this place meant. He reached into his pocket and retrieved the old brass key, scratched, heavy, stubborn. It slipped into the lock with resistance, as if the house itself needed convincing to let him in again. He pressed harder. The door groaned open, releasing a gust of stale air mixed with the faint scent of old books and dried flowers. Inside, light filtered through dusty blinds, catching particles in the air that drifted like ghosts. The house was quiet in a way that pressed against him, quiet enough for him to hear the soft thud of his own heart. Every step he took echoed faintly, the floorboards greeting him with creaks that hadn't changed at all. He paused in the living room. There they were, his mother's framed photographs, unmoved, unshaken, still hanging exactly where she left them. His father, in his postal uniform, was standing proudly with one hand on Daniel's teenage shoulder. His mother, in her Sunday dress, smiled warm enough to thaw any winter. And Daniel himself, too tall, too gangly, drowning in his graduation robe. He picked up the photo of his parents and wiped a streak of dust from the glass with his thumb. "I made it, Mama," he whispered, "just like you said I would." He didn't realize he had closed his eyes until a light tap on the screen door made him open them again. When he walked back to the porch, he saw Mrs. Ruby Harris leaning lightly on her cane, her silver hair glowing in the morning sun. Her smile spread slowly across her face, taking years off her features, though her eyes, sharp, clear, and knowing, still held the weight of time. "Well, Lord have mercy," she said with a soft laugh. "If it isn't Danny Carter, come back home. I knew you'd walk these streets again one day." Daniel opened the door and stepped out, folding his arms in a gesture halfway between formality and affection. "Mrs. Harris, you look as radiant as ever." She waved a dismissive hand. "Boy, don't start lying this early in the morning." But there was warmth in her voice. "I've known you since you were running around here barefoot, scraping your knees on that same walkway. You can't sweet-talk me." Her smile faded slightly as her gaze swept the neighborhood. Curtains twitched around them, quick flashes of eyes that watched but didn't linger, fearful of being caught in the act. "What brings you back after so long, Danny?" she asked. "It's been what, 20, 25 years since you left for college?" "Longer," he murmured. "Felt like it was time. The house needs care, and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe the town does too." Mrs. Harris let out a slow, knowing exhale. Ain't that the truth?" She lowered herself onto the porch swing, the chains creaking in a weary but familiar rhythm. Daniel joined her. The breeze, soft and hesitant, rustled the leaves overhead. "Things have changed," she said quietly, tapping her cane against the boards. "Not for the better." Daniel looked at her, listening deeply. Mrs. Harris was not the kind of woman who gossiped. She was a historian, one who held the story of Riverbend in her bones. "You remember Officer Jones?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Of course, he knew everyone by name." "Well, the new officers they hired, they ain't cut from the same cloth. They don't walk the beat to protect anybody." Her jaw tightened. "They don't want to know us. Don't care to." Daniel followed her gaze to the street. A jogger passed by, a young white woman, her pace quickening when she saw Daniel sitting on the porch. She didn't wave, just looked down and moved faster. Mrs. Harris leaned in. "Families have been disappearing too. The Morgans moved last year. Said the bank took their place over missed mortgage payments. But Mariah Morgan? She saved every receipt, Danny. That woman was meticulous." Daniel's brow furrowed. "And the Browns?" Mrs. Harris continued. "Gone. The Washingtons? Gone too. Each one pushed out, one after the other." "And no one questioned it?" Daniel asked softly. "Oh, we questioned it," she said. "We just didn't get any answers. And folks who asked too many questions found police cruisers parked outside their homes, or mysterious code violations, or surprise welfare checks that broke more doors than they helped." A heaviness settled in Daniel's chest. He had come here expecting to find a town struggling. He hadn't expected to find a town under siege. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. 2 years or so." She tightened her grip on her cane. "Ever since that development company started buying up land around here. Folks say it's about revitalizing Riverbend. But baby, it looks more like clearing us out." Daniel absorbed everything in silence, eyes scanning the houses lining the street. Paint peeling, porches empty. A quiet that didn't feel natural, felt orchestrated, enforced. He stood, taking a slow sip of the coffee he had brewed earlier. Warm, bitter, like the truth he was beginning to taste. As he stepped to the edge of the porch, he heard it before he saw it, the low, mechanical growl of engines, rolling steady and deliberate. 2 police cruisers turned onto the street. His heart didn't race, but something behind his ribs tightened. The cruisers moved slowly, prowling, as though the officers inside were observing a threat. They didn't look at the houses. They didn't look at the street. They looked at him. Daniel raised his coffee mug. Not exactly a greeting, not exactly a challenge, just acknowledgement. The officers didn't respond. Their eyes tracked him as their cars rolled by in exaggerated slow motion, as though reminding him who held power here, as though weighing him. Mrs. Harris shook her head. See that? Used to be you could sit outside on your own front porch without being stared down like a criminal. They always do that? He asked quietly. Oh, they do worse. She exhaled, voice trembling just a little. Riverbend changed, baby. And the folks in charge? They don't expect anybody to stand up to them. Not anymore. Daniel watched the cruisers disappear around the bend. He remained still long after the sound faded. Something inside him shifted. A slow burn is taking hold, a quiet vow forming beneath his calm surface. Mrs. Harris tapped his arm gently. You be careful, Danny, she said. This town ain't the same one you left. And these men? She paused. They think Riverbend belongs to them now. Daniel nodded once, deeply. He looked back at the porch, the cracked steps, the peeling paint, the ghosts in dust-covered frames. He thought of his parents, their lessons, their sacrifices. He thought of the neighbors watching from behind curtains. And in the quiet of that morning, Daniel Carter understood something profound. He had not simply come home. He had stepped into a battlefield disguised as a neighborhood, a place where injustice had planted roots, a place that would demand courage, compassion, and truth to reclaim. And whether Riverbend knew it or not, whether it welcomed him or not, he was ready. Because some homes aren't meant to be walked away from. Some homes are meant to be fought for, arrested for existing while black. The late morning sun in Riverbend had a way of deceiving the eye, bright enough to suggest warmth and safety, silent enough to conceal the danger that moved beneath its surface. Dr. Daniel Carter stood on the porch of his childhood home, sleeves rolled up, carefully scrubbing years of tarnish from the old brass numbers nailed beside the doorframe. The metal, dulled by time, was fighting him, but Daniel was patient. He'd spent his whole life fighting battles that he didn't want to be won. What was a little brass compared to that? His trench coat hung by the door, but he kept his badge tucked deep inside it. He hadn't come to Riverbend to announce himself. He'd come to understand. As he polished the numbers, a soft breeze carried the scent of magnolia blossoms across the yard. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe in the memory of gentle childhood mornings, before the world revealed its sharp edges. Then the sound came, a low animal growl of an engine rolling up too slow, too heavy, too intentional. Daniel didn't turn immediately, but every muscle tightened, every instinct sharpened. He had heard that sound in too many towns, too many times, each with the same rhythm, suspicion disguised as duty. A police cruiser stopped in front of his house, then another. Car doors slammed, two hard, deliberate cracks that split the quiet morning in half. Daniel lowered the cloth, still not turning. Boots approached on gravel, each step heavy with ownership. A voice cracked through the air like a whip. Hey, you! What do you think you're doing? Daniel turned slowly. Officer Kyle Ricks, young, white, jaw clenched so tightly it reshaped his face, stood a few feet away, hand already grazing his weapon as though touching it brought him comfort. Beside him, Officer Ben Hardy watched with a smirk that didn't touch his eyes. Good morning, Daniel said, steady, polite, collected. Can I help you, officers? Ricks took a step closer, his shadow sliding over Daniel's porch. We got a call about suspicious activity. This is private property. Daniel studied the officer's stance, the tilt of his chin, the certainty in his voice. He wasn't asking. He wasn't investigating. He was accusing. I'm cleaning my house number, Daniel said. This is my property. Hardy barked out a mocking laugh. Your property, huh? Yeah, okay. Let's see some ID. Daniel noticed movement across the street, curtains shifting, phones rising discreetly. Riverbend was watching. Riverbend had seen this scene before. He lifted his hand slightly, palms open. My identification is in my coat. I'll reach for it slowly. Hands where we can see them, Rick snapped, voice cracking with an edge of exhilaration. His hand dropped fully onto his gun. Daniel froze. He had seen enough shootings, personally, professionally, historically, to know what came next when a black man moved too fast in America. He spoke quietly, his voice an anchor in rising chaos. My wallet is in my inner coat pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly, with your permission. Hardy moved around him, flanking him like a predator circling prey. Then hurry up, he spat. Daniel moved with the precision of a surgeon, slowly, smoothly, without sudden angles. He retrieved the wallet and extended it with 2 fingers. Rick snatched it with disdain, flipping it open. His expression shifted, not to understanding, but to irritation. This says you're Daniel Carter, and you expect us to believe this is your house? It is my house, Daniel answered. I inherited it. There's a deed inside. Shut up, Rick snapped, throwing the wallet toward Hardy like a piece of trash. Daniel inhaled slowly. The humiliation wasn't personal. It was institutional. It had been rehearsed on countless black men before him. Turn around, Rick's ordered, voice dripping with triumph. Hands behind your back. Daniel stood still, rooted in dignity. Officer, he said calmly, you have no legal grounds to detain me. I live here. I am... That was when the world exploded. Ricks grabbed Daniel's arm and slammed him face first against the exterior wall. The rough siding scraped his cheek, ripping skin open in a hot, sharp line of pain. Gas rippled through the neighborhood. The phone's filming jerked with shock. Stop resisting, Ricks shouted. Daniel wasn't resisting. He hadn't moved. But the lie had been spoken. And in towns like Riverbend, the lies spoken by white officers became truth before they ever hit paper. Hardy yanked Daniel's other arm, twisting it so sharply he felt tendons strain. Cold metal bit savagely into his wrists as cuffs ratcheted tight, too tight, intentionally tight. Pain radiated through his arms, but his voice remained steady. I am not resisting, he said through clenched teeth. This is an unlawful arrest. Oh, look, he knows the law, Hardy mocked, patting him down with unnecessary force. Maybe he went to college or something. Across the street, Mrs. Ruby Harris emerged from her porch like a storm cloud ready to break. You leave that man alone, she shouted. That's Dr. Carter. That is his house. Ricks's head snapped toward her. Ma'am, stay back, or you'll be next. The threat wasn't empty. Riverbend had seen too many elderly black residents cuffed for obstruction. Neighbors gathered now, forming small clusters, some filming, some shouting protests, others trembling with the weight of déjà vu. This ain't right, someone yelled. We see you. We're recording everything, another called. The officers didn't falter. This was a performance, a message, an assertion of dominance. They shoved Daniel forward. He stumbled but kept his dignity intact, straightening even in pain. Hardy pushed his head down aggressively as they stuffed him into the back of the patrol car. The door slammed, a violent period at the end of a sentence no one had the right to write. Through the window, Daniel saw Mrs. Harris standing tall despite her trembling cane, her phone raised high, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. You hear me? She yelled. We're calling everybody. You picked the wrong one today. Hardy shouted back through the window. Next person who interferes gets arrested for obstruction. The cruiser pulled away, leaving a trail of dust and disbelief. Children were pulled inside. Mothers held their breath. Neighbors exchanged looks heavy with sorrow and familiarity. Inside the car, Daniel sat upright, breath controlled, eyes unwavering. He had been in cuffs before, training simulations, mock drills, but never like this. Never with the ghosts of his parents' home fading behind him, replaced by the cold gleam of a police cage. He spoke once, quietly to the officers in front. You're making a serious mistake. Shut up, Rick snapped. Save it for the station. Daniel looked out the window, at the street where he had learned to ride a bike, where he had scraped his knee in front of Mrs. Harris's house, where his father had taught him how to see people for who they were, not what the world said they were. And now he was being taken from that street in handcuffs. It was the oldest American story told in the newest ways. A black man arrested for existing, for standing, for being, for daring to belong. And even though Daniel Carter possessed a title powerful enough to shake the walls of Washington, none of that mattered in the back of that patrol car, because in that moment, he wasn't Director Carter. He was another black man swallowed by a system that treated his skin like a crime scene. The cruiser turned a corner. The house disappeared behind him, but something awoke within him, slow, steady, inevitable. A fire, Not of revenge, but of truth. Because some arrests don't end in jail cells. Some arrests awaken nations. And this one, this humiliation, witnessed by neighbors who had been silenced too long, would ignite something no pair of handcuffs could contain. You just arrested the wrong black man. The Cypress Bayou Police Department might have been in Riverbend, but it felt like another world entirely once Dr. Daniel Carter stepped through its double doors in handcuffs. The fluorescent lighting hummed overhead, cold and indifferent, casting a sickly glow over scuffed linoleum floors and outdated bulletin boards. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him. Not with curiosity, not with humanity, but with that familiar blend of disdain and amusement reserved especially for black men in handcuffs. The kind of look that said, "We already know who you are. We already know what you are," and none of them had any idea. Officer Ricks pushed Daniel forward with an unnecessary shove. "Look what we caught trespassing on Oak Street," he announced proudly, as though parading a trophy. Hardy snickered. City Slicker thought he could just walk onto someone else's property. Daniel kept his posture straight, the cuffs biting into his wrists, pain radiating through his arms. "I'd like to contact my lawyer," he said clearly, calmly, his voice slicing through the room. Hardy let out a theatrical laugh. "Oh, listen to this guy. Lawyer talk already. Bet he reads a lot of books." Laughter from a few desks. None of it surprised Daniel. This was how corruption protected itself. Through mockery, intimidation, group performance. The booking sergeant, a heavyset man named Peters, shuffled toward them with visible boredom. He didn't even look at Daniel as he spoke. "Name?" Daniel waited a beat, eyes locked on the man who was about to write lies into reality. "Dr. Daniel Carter, and I am formally requesting my phone call." Peters grunted, unimpressed. "You're awfully demanding for someone caught breaking and entering." Ricks yanked Daniel's cuffs tighter, and a sharp bolt of pain shot up his arms. "Maybe a few hours in holding will loosen that tongue," he said. Daniel exhaled carefully, ignoring the pain. "The law requires you to give me a phone call. You also haven't read me my rights, nor have you documented the actual reason for my arrest." The room grew still for a moment, not because they respected him, but because his knowledge irritated them. Peter's jaw flexed. "You some kind of lawyer?" Daniel met his eyes without flinching. "No, just a citizen who knows his rights." Hardy grabbed a clipboard and began scribbling. Daniel watched each stroke of the pen. He knew exactly what was happening. "Suspect resisted arrest," Hardy read aloud as he wrote, smirking. "Displayed a hostile attitude, ignored lawful commands." "That is false," Daniel said firmly. "There are multiple witnesses with video evidence to prove—" "Your word against ours," Rick sneered. "And take a wild guess who people believe around here." Before Daniel could respond, a heavy door slammed open and shook the room. Chief Raymond Dalton strode in. A large man with a red face, a sweat-stained uniform, and the barely controlled temper of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "What's all this?" he demanded, chest heaving as he looked from Daniel to the officers. "Caught this one trespassing on Oak Street," Rick said. "Got real mouthy about his rights." Dalton walked around Daniel slowly, inspecting him like livestock at auction. "Nice neighborhood," he grunted. "Too nice for some folks, if you catch my meaning." Daniel looked him in the eye. "I'm still waiting for my phone call." Dalton's brow twitched. Annoyance. Confusion. Something else is hiding behind it. "And I noticed Officer Rick's body cam is turned off," Daniel added. "That violates departmental policy. Section 8.4, paragraph 3. Dalton froze. Not much. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Daniel noticed everything. "You seem awfully familiar with police procedure," the chief said. "I make it my business to know the law," Daniel replied. "I also noticed the wrong address on that booking report. The property is 1242 Oak Street, not 1224. An important detail for the record." Dalton snatched the clipboard from Hardy, his face darkening. "Get him his phone call," he snapped. "Then put him in holding." Ricks and Hardy dragged Daniel toward a grimy wall-mounted phone. His shoulder brushed against peeling paint. Every inch of this building felt like neglect left to fester. Daniel dialed from memory. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. Peters asked, "You done?" "Yes." Daniel said. "We can proceed with booking." He was led to a small cell with a metal bench that felt as cold as the air around him. When the door clanged shut, he sat with perfect posture, every inch of him calm, intentional, unbroken. From down the hallway, he heard them laughing. "City boy gonna learn," Hardy said. "Should have stayed where he came from," Ricks added. Daniel closed his eyes, committing their voices to memory, their badge numbers, their procedural violations, their lies. He was quiet, but inside him a storm gathered. Not anger, but clarity. Then cutting through the noise, the chief's voice boomed. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand, sir. But we had no idea." The whole station fell quiet. A silence so abrupt it felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. Dalton's voice dropped to a tremble. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Footsteps approached the holding cells. Heavy, hesitant, sweaty palms fumbling at keys. The cell door swung open. Dalton stood there, no longer red-faced with authority, but pale, drained, as if the foundation beneath him had cracked. "My office now," he muttered. Daniel walked past him without a word. Officers who had laughed earlier pressed themselves against walls, avoiding eye contact as if shame alone might shield them. Dalton's office was cluttered with self-awarded plaques and framed photos of him with politicians. But now those symbols of power only highlighted his fragility. Phones rang nonstop. Dalton answered one, and his voice broke. "Director Matthews." "Yes, yes, sir, I understand the severity. We had no idea that Dr. Carter was—" A sharp voice on the speaker cut him off. "That's FBI Director Carter to you, and your department is facing a full federal investigation." Dalton's hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the phone. On another line, the state attorney general's voice boomed. "We're sending a team to collect all body cam footage and documentation immediately. And if any cameras were turned off, Chief Dalton, expect additional charges." Dalton looked like he might vomit. Just then, Officer Ricks burst in. "Chief, the media's outside. Something about—" He went silent. His eyes landed on Daniel, standing calmly, watching him. Daniel spoke quietly. "Officer Ricks, I trust you've begun documenting the excessive force used during my arrest?" Ricks stepped back so fast he stumbled. The chief cleared his throat. "Effective immediately," came the FBI director's voice through the speaker. "Officers Ricks and Hardy are suspended pending a full federal investigation. And Chief Dalton, you will cooperate fully." Dalton could only nod. Daniel stood, adjusting his cuffs. "I'll need my personal effects returned, and I believe a state trooper is waiting to drive me home." "Yes, sir," Dalton whispered. Every ounce of swagger had drained from him. Every ounce of racism that once felt safe now quivered in the face of accountability. As Daniel walked through the station, the same station that had mocked him, chained him, humiliated him, silence followed him like a shadow. The booking sergeant tried to hide the falsified report. Other officers stared at the floor. The power dynamic had flipped so quickly that it left them dizzy. Outside, cameras flashed. A crowd was gathering. Whispers rippled through Riverbend. "They arrested who?" They targeted the wrong man. Director of the FBI, Lord have mercy. Uno, a young black state trooper stood waiting beside a spotless cruiser. "Director Carter," he said, standing at attention, "I'm here to escort you home." Daniel nodded, stepping into the sunlight. And Riverbend, for the first time in years, exhaled. Because in that moment, one truth rose above all others. They hadn't just arrested a black man on his own porch. They had exposed themselves. And justice had finally stepped into the light. The break-in, the threat, and the awakening fire night settled over Riverbend with a deceptive gentleness. Warm air drifting through the cracked window frames, cicadas humming in the distance, and porch lights flickering across the neighborhood like small vigilant eyes. But inside Daniel Carter's childhood home, sleep refused to come. The day's events, the humiliation, the arrest, the shift in power, still rippled through him like aftershocks from a quake. He paced the hallways, touching the familiar walls his father once painted, running his fingers over corners where his mother had taped birthday banners year after year. These walls held decades of memory, but tonight, they held something else. A cold breeze brushed across his cheek. Daniel stilled. He checked the windows, all closed. He stepped into the living room, and his breath caught. The room wasn't just disturbed, it was violated. Furniture overturned, books ripped from shelves, papers scattered like autumn leaves, family photo albums torn apart, their pages littering the floor. His mother's handwriting stamped into the margins of childhood pictures, now trampled beneath boots that did not belong to him. But the detail that stung worst was the shattered vase on the floor, a delicate blue and white porcelain piece his mother had cherished. It had survived 2 moves, a storm, and time itself. It hadn't survived the people who wanted him gone. Daniel crouched beside the wreckage, pieces glinting like broken memories. Pain twisted something inside him, not fear, something deeper, something sacred. A message was written on the coffee table in thick black marker. Leave or else, the words were simple, but their violence was unmistakable. He pulled out his phone to take photos of everything. His FBI training flooded back, methodical, calm, detached even through the rising tension in his chest. Then he saw it, a small black device, no larger than a coin, tucked beneath the couch, blinking faintly. A listening device. Not amateur work, not kids, not random, professional, precise, purposeful. Someone wanted to hear every breath he took. His jaw tightened. That quiet fire in him, the one ignited on the porch, stoked in the back of the squad car, began to burn hotter. He bent down to inspect it, snapping photos. That's when the window exploded. Glass rained inward in a violent cascade as a brick sailed through, landing inches from him. He dropped instinctively to the floor, rolling behind the overturned couch. Years of training snapped into place. Through the jagged opening in the shattered window, he saw movement, quick, darting, a shadow figure sprinting across his yard. "Not tonight," he muttered. He launched himself toward the door, pain shooting through his legs but adrenaline wiping it clean. He tore down the porch steps, chasing the masked figure across the lawn. The intruder was fast, weaving through shadows, vaulting over Mrs. Harris's fence with practiced ease. Daniel was faster. He closed the distance, but just as he reached for the intruder's jacket, the figure slipped into darkness, gone, swallowed by the maze of backyards. Porch lights snapped on. "Danny! Danny!" Mrs. Harris's voice trembled from her doorstep. "I'm calling the police." "Stay inside," he called back, scanning the tree line. "Please stay inside." He heard distant sirens, slow at first, reluctant, as if summoned unwillingly. When officers Peterson and Martinez finally arrived, they strolled casually from their cruiser, flashlights moving lazily across the yard. "Well, well," Peterson drawled, shining his light directly into Daniel's eyes. "Having trouble settling in, Director?" He emphasized the title with mockery, disguised under a thin veneer of politeness. Daniel explained the break-in, the damage, and the bug. Martinez took notes in the same way a child might scribble during a class he had no intention of passing. "Probably just some kids," Peterson said, kicking a shattered photo frame. "You know how they get. New neighbors, old house. Maybe they're not used to you yet." "Not used to me?" Daniel repeated quietly. Peterson shrugged. "Riverbends, particular." Daniel held his gaze. "I want this investigated properly." "We'll look into it," Martinez said, already walking back to the cruiser. They wouldn't. Daniel knew they wouldn't. They weren't here to solve a crime. They were here to deliver another message. Before he could say more, another car door slammed. Councilwoman Anita Rhodes strode up the path, eyes fierce despite the concern tightening her features. "Officers," she said sharply, "are you conducting a full investigation?" "Yes, ma'am," Martinez lied without hesitation. "Nothing to see here." They left before she could protest. Anita turned to Daniel, grabbing his arm. "Inside, now, before they circle back to report anything you say." They stepped through the wreckage. Anita's face tightened as she surveyed the shattered room. "God, Danny, they really did this." "Not random," Daniel said. "Someone wanted me scared, or gone." She didn't disagree. Instead, she reached into her jacket and unfolded a sheet of paper, its edges worn from anxious handling. A list of names. He was at the top, marked with a red X. Where did you get this? He asked. Sources in City Hall, she whispered. Everyone on this list challenged the power structure. They disappeared, or had accidents, or they just stopped speaking up. She swallowed hard. Danny, I need you to leave Riverbend for your safety. He looked around the ruined room. This wasn't meant to scare me into leaving, he said softly. This was meant to show the lengths they'll go. And that's exactly why you should leave. Her voice cracked. These people play for keeps. Daniel stepped closer, the fire inside him steadying his voice. If I leave, who fights for the next person? Or the next family pushed out? Or the next kid growing up thinking this is normal? His eyes hardened. No, I'm not running. Anita's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in resignation. You're going to force this town to face itself, she whispered. Maybe that's what it's time for. The first gray hints of dawn crept through the shattered window. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the listening device under a desk lamp. Beside it, a growing list of names connected by one thread. Power misused, neighbors displaced, lives uprooted. Anita watched him, admiration mixing with fear. They're going to come after your reputation next, she warned. That's how they play. They'll smear you, manufacture stories, twist facts. Daniel didn't stop writing. Let them try, he said. You fight darkness by dragging it into the light. He studied the circuitry of the bug, its tiny wires glinting under the lamp. This, he said softly, is their mistake. Why? It tells me they're afraid. The sun rose fully now, filling the ruined room with warm light. And Daniel Carter, the man they tried to intimidate, manipulate, and chase out of his own home, sipped cold coffee with steady hands. He didn't feel fear anymore, only purpose. And in that moment, the battle for Riverbend truly began. Because sometimes injustice pushes too far. Sometimes the oppressor overplays their hand. And sometimes the moment meant to silence a man becomes the spark that awakens an entire community. The document trail, the conspiracy, and the town's hidden machinery morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Councilwoman Anita Rhodes' cramped office, casting stripes of gold across her desk piled high with files. Hundreds of pages of complaints, eviction records, foreclosure notices, zoning requests, and letters from desperate families who never received answers. It was the kind of glowing, peaceful light that should have made the room feel warm. Instead, it illuminated the quiet violence hidden in the paperwork. Daniel sat in a worn leather chair across from her, trench coat draped over the back, bruises still dark beneath his eyes. Sleeping had been impossible, but clarity? He had plenty of that now. Anita tugged open a locked filing cabinet and pulled out several folders, dust motes floating in the air, like tiny ghosts of the lives contained within. I've been keeping these for years, she said, dropping a stack onto the desk with a heavy thud. Every time someone came to me with a complaint, every report, every letter, I made copies, the originals. Well, they have a way of disappearing from official records. Daniel opened the first file. Handwritten complaints, trembling signatures, a man describing officers who barged into his home without a warrant. A grandmother was shoved to the ground during a welfare check. A family was forced out of their house with papers signed by a judge who never saw their case. Stamped in red across many of them. Dismissed. No action required. Insufficient grounds. But the handwriting, the fear, told the real story. Anita pointed at one report. This one was Mrs. Jackson, 72 years old. They threw her to the ground. When she filed a complaint, they threatened to arrest her grandson. Daniel's jaw tightened. The responding officers were the same ones who arrested him, Ricks and Hardy, their names repeated like a dark refrain throughout the documents. These officers are new, Anita said. Brought in by Chief Dalton, young, aggressive, loyal to him above the law. Daniel kept reading. Every page confirmed what Riverbend residents already knew in their bones. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a system. Anita opened another drawer, pulling out a town map covered with red dots. These represent homes lost in the past 5 years. Daniel leaned over it. The pattern struck him immediately. They're all clustered. Exactly, Anita said, within 3 blocks of the proposed highway expansion. Daniel's mind snapped into investigative focus. Show me the documentation, he said. She spread more papers across the desk. Foreclosure notices, tax reassessments, citations. Look at these signatures, she said. The notary stamps, identical on every document. Daniel pulled on his reading glasses, examining the details. Not similar, identical, meaning forged. And the dates, Anita added, leaning close. Some are stamped on Sundays. Government offices aren't open then. A knock sounded at the door. A young man stepped inside, late 20s, lean frame, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes were tired but sharp. Corey Johnson, he introduced himself, offering Daniel a hand. Reporter for the Riverbend Chronicle. What's left of it? Anita nodded. Corey's been digging into this for months. Trying to anyway, he said. My editor killed my last story. Said it wasn't newsworthy. He opened his laptop and turned it toward them. The screen displayed a massive spreadsheet. Names, addresses, dates, shell companies, bank codes. Daniel leaned in. What am I looking at? A pattern, Corey said. Every time a major development project comes to town, the same thing happens. Black homeowners get hit with citations, inflated property taxes, surprise inspections, or criminal charges, and then, eventually, foreclosure. He clicked on another tab. These companies that buy the seized homes, they're all LLCs registered to the same office. Whose office? Daniel asked. Chief Dalton's brother-in-law. A cold heaviness fell over the room. And the notary who signs everything? Corey continued. The mayor's secretary. Daniel inhaled slowly. The pieces were crystallizing. Every thread ties back to the same hands. Here's the worst one, Corey said, pulling up a foreclosure notice. The Williams family. They owned their home free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. But suddenly their house gets foreclosed? Daniel scanned the document. It's signed by Mrs. Williams. Right, Corey said. Except, he clicked another file. Mrs. Williams died a month earlier. The room went silent. Anita checked her watch. The county clerk's office opens in 15 minutes. If we go now, we can pull original property records before anybody realizes we're digging. Move fast, Daniel said. The clock's ticking. They gathered everything, locking the rest in Anita's cabinet. As they headed for the door, Daniel paused. One more thing, he said. Corey, can you access property tax records? See who's paying taxes on these houses now? Already working on it, Corey said. But most are listed under numbered LLCs. I'll need a contact at the tax assessor's office. Then let's move, Daniel said. The county clerk's office sat in a squat brick building that smelled faintly of mildew and tired bureaucracy. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they approached a thin woman behind the desk, Mrs. Pearson, the county clerk. She saw them and stiffened. Can I help you? Daniel stepped forward. We need to view property records from the past 5 years. Mrs. Pearson's fingers twitched around her pen. I need to check with my supervisor. That won't be necessary. Anita placed her councilwoman ID on the counter. These are public records. Mrs. Pearson swallowed hard. Her eyes darted toward a camera in the corner. Then she nodded. Archive room. Through that door. Sign the visitor log. Inside, the archive room felt like a graveyard for secrets. Metal shelves stretched floor to ceiling, packed tight with records. Dust floated thick in the air. Corey set up his laptop. Daniel and Anita split the shelves. For 20 tense minutes, nothing existed but the sound of pages flipping, phones snapping photos, and soft murmurs as the truth unfolded. Danny, Anita whispered urgently, look at this. She held tax reassessments showing sudden 300% increases, right before foreclosure proceedings began. Same assessor's signature, Daniel said, on all of them. My guess? Anita murmured. Someone pressured her or paid her. Got something else, Corey said, spreading documents across a side table. Look at these deeds, impossible dates, people signing away property after they'd already died. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was more than theft. This was engineered displacement, systematic, targeted, deliberate. Movement caught Daniel's eye through the glass door. 2 men entered, plain clothes but unmistakable. Ricks and Hardy. Mrs. Pearson pointed toward the archive room. They're here, Daniel murmured. Anita immediately began taking photographs of every document they'd touched. Corey backed up his files onto a USB drive, typing frantically. A shadow darkened the doorway. Hardy appeared, bumping into Corey as he passed. "Oh, sorry," he smirked, slipping something from Corey's pocket. Corey's expression tightened. "They took the drive." "Not everything," Anita whispered, clutching her phone. "I backed up most of it, and Corey has files at home." Daniel kept his expression neutral. We walk out calmly, no sudden moves. Ricks blocked their exit. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "Public records," Anita said evenly. "Available to anyone." Rick sneered. They pushed past him. Once outside, the sunlight felt harsh, too bright for the darkness they'd uncovered. "We meet at my house in an hour," Daniel said. "No detours." They parted to separate cars. From inside the building, Hardy tossed the stolen USB drive smugly. They thought they'd won. They had no idea a wildfire had already begun. Corey's small apartment above the laundromat buzzed with tension. Papers, sticky notes, and half-eaten takeout containers littered every surface. His investigative wall, photos connected by string and notes, looked like a map of Riverbend's buried sins. Most of his deep research was still intact. They hadn't destroyed everything, but the threat lingered like smoke. Daniel paced the room, thoughts moving faster than his steps. Anita sifted through her photos. Corey pulled up old files on his cracked screen. That's when Daniel's phone buzzed. Mrs. Harris. Her voice trembled. "Danny, listen now. You got a snake in your garden. Someone pretending to help you ain't who you think." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "I can't say. Just watch your back." The call ended. Before he could process the warning, heavy footsteps thundered outside. A fist hammered the door. "Police, open up!" Corey's face went pale. "Back door!" Before they could reach it, the front door burst open, splitting at the hinges. Officers flooded in, guns raised. "Everybody on the ground!" Hardy roared. Daniel raised his hands. Anita froze. Corey backed away. "This is an illegal entry," Daniel said. Ricks thrust a paper at him. "Search warrant. Johnson is suspected of stealing county property." "Those were public records," Anita shouted. The officers ransacked the apartment, destroying files, smashing equipment. Corey's laptop hit the floor, screen shattering. "Hey!" he cried. Hardy slammed him into the wall, cuffing him brutally tight. "Resisting arrest," he sneered. Daniel's fist clenched, but he stayed still. Anita's phone buzzed. She glanced down and gasped. Photos of her teenage son, staged, doctored, threatening. Daniel gave her a subtle shake of his head. Not now. As they dragged Corey into the street, neighbors watched, horrified, helpless. His notebook fell from his pocket. An officer crushed it under his boot. The cruisers pulled away. Silence settled over the wrecked apartment like a suffocating fog. Daniel scanned the debris and saw it. A loose floorboard, hidden, untouched, waiting. They hadn't destroyed everything, not yet. And the people responsible had made their most dangerous mistake. They pushed too far, and they awakened a man and a town who would not bow. The night ambush and the breaking point night in Riverbend had a strange stillness. The kind that didn't soothe but warned. A stillness too deliberate, too careful, like the whole town was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered weakly as Dr. Daniel Carter drove through narrow lanes whose shadows felt darker than they should have. He should have felt exhausted. Instead, he felt electric, aware of every sound, every movement, every breath. After the raid on Corey's apartment, after Anita received the photos meant to silence her, after the police showed their true allegiance, Daniel knew one thing for certain. They weren't trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to break him. And when breaking didn't work, they would try something else. He turned onto Willow Creek Road, the familiar oak trees arching overhead like solemn witnesses. His headlights swept across the darkened yard, revealing only the occasional stray cat or overturned trash can. He dialed Anita on the hands-free speaker. "Did your son get home safe?" "Yeah," she whispered, voice trembling. "He's scared. I'm trying to keep him calm, but, Danny, this is getting dangerous." "It's already dangerous," he said gently, "but we're close to exposing them. Close is what gets people killed." Daniel didn't disagree. He hung up just as he approached the bend in the road, the point where the streetlights ended and the forest pressed closer. That's when he saw them. Headlights, approaching from behind at alarming speed. A black SUV, unmarked. No lights, no sirens. Just aggression. Daniel's pulse sharpened. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. The SUV veered, swerving in a way no ordinary driver would. He glanced at his rearview mirror. Only a split second, but it was enough time for the vehicle to gain on him. And then, crash. The SUV rammed him from behind. Metal screamed. Daniel's car lurched forward violently. His seatbelt locked around his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. What? He didn't finish, because the SUV hit him again. Harder. This time his car skidded sideways, tires screeching as he struggled to regain control. He gritted his teeth, jaw tight. Every instinct he possessed surged to the surface. This was intentional, calculated, a hit. The SUV swerved to his side now, forcing him toward the ditch. Daniel grabbed the wheel and turned sharply. His car fishtailed. His heart pounded with a sickening rhythm in his ears. Then a second SUV appeared ahead of him, blocking the road. No, Daniel whispered. He hit the brakes just in time. The first SUV rammed him again, smashing him between the two vehicles like a hunted animal caught in a trap. The world tilted. Glass shattered. His head hit the steering wheel. His vision flickered. He tasted blood. Figures emerged, dark silhouettes with masks, moving with military efficiency. One shouted, "He's still alive! Finish it!" A gunshot cracked the night. A bullet tore through his driver's side window, embedding itself in the headrest inches from his skull. Daniel forced his trembling hand to reach for the door. He pushed it open and rolled onto the ground, pain shooting through his side. More shots rang out, splintering wood and tearing through metal. He crawled toward the ditch, the cool mud grounding him, the scent of wet earth filling his lungs. Another shot shattered a tree trunk beside him. Adrenaline surged, burning away hesitation. He forced himself up and sprinted, limping, injured, but moving, into the thick underbrush behind Willow Creek Road. Branches slapped his face. Twigs tore at his clothes. The pain in his ribs throbbed with every breath. "Fan out!" a masked man shouted. "He couldn't have gone far." Daniel stumbled deeper into the woods, guided by instinct and desperation. His breath rasped loudly in his ears, masked by the crunch of boots behind him. His foot caught on a root. He fell hard, agony radiating from his ribs. He bit down to keep from crying out. Through the trees, beams of flashlights sliced the darkness. "Check that way. We need the body." Their words chilled him. They weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to erase him. He crawled toward a small tool shed near the edge of a backyard. Old, rusted, half-collapsed. He slipped inside, pulling the warped door shut with shaking hands. Inside, darkness swallowed him completely. His breath came in ragged gasps. His pulse hammered in his skull. Blood trickled down his forehead, dripping onto the dirt floor. He pressed his back against the wall, willing himself to be still. Boots approached outside. He covered his mouth with his hand. A flashlight beam pierced through a crack in the wall. It passed over him, inches away. "Not here," a voice muttered. "He's bleeding. He won't get far." The footsteps moved on. Daniel's body trembled in the suffocating dark. But his mind was sharp, focused, refusing to break. He reached into his pocket with slow, deliberate movements. His phone. The screen was cracked, barely responsive, but he knew the emergency command sequence by heart, a code known only by senior federal officials. He entered it blindly. A tiny chime confirmed transmission. A signal pulsed into the night. If anyone in the FBI was listening, they would know. Director Carter is in mortal danger. Immediate extraction needed. His vision blurred again. His breath shortened. Voices echoed outside. "He's close. Search every yard. Make sure the chief knows we tracked him down." They should have done this from day one. Daniel leaned his head against the wall. He felt consciousness slipping. Not from fear, not from defeat, but from blood loss. He fought it, inhaling sharply. Once, twice, fighting to stay awake. He thought of Anita's son, of Mrs. Harris's trembling voice warning him, of Corey being dragged away in handcuffs, of the families who had lost everything to a system designed to crush them. He thought of his mother's photo album, shattered on his living room floor. No, not here. Not like this. Not in the dark. But the darkness was relentless. His eyes fluttered. His phone buzzed. A single message illuminated the cracked screen. Agent Morales. Hold on. Help inbound. He exhaled a broken breath of relief. Then the world dimmed. Footsteps grew faint. Sirens, distant, then closer. The shed door rattled. Once, twice. Director Carter, FBI, we're coming in. But Daniel's eyes had already closed. The last thing he felt was the warmth of a hand on his shoulder and a voice whispering, "Stay with us. Stay with us." Then everything went silent. Sometimes the battle for justice is fought in the light. Sometimes it is fought in the shadows. And sometimes, like tonight, it is fought in the space between life and death. But heroes are not defined by how close they come to falling. They are defined by the courage that rises even when they do. The press conference that shook America. The world returned to Daniel Carter in fragments. A flicker of white light, a muffled hum, the sterile scent of antiseptic. It felt like surfacing from deep underwater, lungs burning, mind heavy. A rhythmic beeping anchored him to reality. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him was a blank slab of hospital white. His throat felt raw, his body heavy, his left arm throbbing beneath thick bandages. When he tried to lift his right hand, metal clinked. Handcuffs, cold, tight, unmistakable. Even now, even after the shooting, after the chase, after nearly bleeding out in a stranger's tool shed, they had chained him. A symbol clearer than any words. You are the enemy. You are the threat. You are the one we must silence. He let the truth settle, cold and sharp. Two FBI agents stood posted outside the open doorway, their silhouettes stiff and alert. Beyond them, through the window overlooking the parking lot, Daniel saw a swarm of reporters. Cameras raised, microphones extended, vans covered in satellite dishes. The whole world was waiting. "Hey," a soft voice murmured beside him. He turned. Anita Rhodes sat in a chair pulled close to his bed. Exhaustion etched deep lines around her eyes. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair hastily pinned back. She hadn't slept in days. That much was clear. But she was here, still standing, still fighting, still believing in him. "You scared us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They said you might not make it." Daniel swallowed, wincing as pain rippled through his chest. "How long?" he rasped. 2 days. Anita poured water into a cup, guiding a straw to his lips. "You lost a lot of blood. They barely stabilized you." He drank slowly. Water felt like fire and relief all at once. "And the handcuffs?" he asked, glancing down. Anita's jaw tightened. "The mayor's office demanded it. They're calling you a fugitive, a violent suspect, a danger to the community." Her voice broke into bitter laughter. "Now that their scheme's unraveling, lies are all they have left." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Of course. When power feels cornered, it claws. "And Corey?" he asked. "He's safe," she said. "They raided his apartment again, but he wasn't there. He's still publishing. He refused to stop. Reporters all over the country have picked up his work." Daniel breathed in slowly. "And your son?" Pain flashed across Anita's face. "They tried again," she whispered, sliding her phone toward him. "More photos. This time even more convincing. They want to break me, Danny. They want me to back down." Her hands trembled. "But I won't." She leaned closer, fierce despite her fear. "No matter what they do, I won't abandon you. Or this town." From beneath her jacket, she pulled out a small, black recording device and pressed it discreetly into the pillow under Daniel's arm. His eyes widened. "This," he whispered. "Testimonies," she said. "Confessions, phone calls, forged documents, even officers turning against Dalton. Everything we need." Daniel's breath caught. "They won't let us publish it," Anita continued. "They already got a court order blocking unverified allegations. They think if they slow us down, they can recover." Daniel stared at her exhaustion, her bravery, her refusal to surrender, and something inside him steadied. They can block a publication, he said slowly, but not a live statement. Anita met his eyes, startled, then understanding dawned. You're thinking of, yes, he whispered, a press conference, right here, right now, with the entire nation watching. As if summoned by the thought, a burst of camera flashes lit up the hospital windows. Voices echoed down the hall. News alerts chimed repeatedly on Anita's phone. You're trending worldwide, she said, half in disbelief. People are demanding answers. Daniel pressed the nurse call button. When a nurse entered, she looked startled to see him awake. Even more startled when he said, I want to address the press. Sir, you're barely stable. This can't wait, Daniel said, voice steady despite the pain. Please inform the hospital administration. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and hurried away. Anita placed her hand gently on his good arm. You're sure about this? I'm not sure about anything, Daniel admitted, except that we can't let them rewrite the story. And in that moment, despite the bandages, despite the handcuffs, despite the ache that made his breath shallow, Daniel felt anchored, alive, determined, unbreakable. 1 hour later, room 412 became the center of the American conscience. Journalists filled every inch of space, their cameras mounted on tripods, microphones layered in front of Daniel like a chorus of steel flowers. Nurses, doctors, and FBI personnel pressed against the walls. Some looked angry, some looked nervous, some looked hopeful. The room buzzed with energy, the sharp electric kind that precedes truth. Daniel sat upright, despite his wounds, his signature brown trench coat draped over his shoulders like a mantle of defiance. The bloodstains on it were visible, raw, real, undeniable, a reminder of what had been done and why. A reporter called out, Director Carter, what happened the night you were shot? Daniel raised his hand. I'll explain everything, he said, but first, the truth needs to be heard. He reached under the pillow and withdrew the recorder Anita had hidden. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters leaned forward. Anita held her breath. Daniel pressed play. The room fell silent. Voices filled the air. The mayor is discussing kickbacks. Developers plotting which black families to displace next. Chief Dalton ordered illegal surveillance. Officers laughing about falsifying reports. A clerk admitting she forged signatures. A deputy mayor bragging about cleaning out the neighborhood. Every lie, every crime, every cruelty laid bare. Daniel looked at the cameras. This, he said, is what happens when racism becomes policy, when corruption becomes normal, when intimidation becomes government. He took a slow breath. But this is also what happens when people refuse to stay silent. Outside, reporters were already broadcasting live. Inside, agents received orders through their earpieces. Search warrants, arrest teams, federal intervention. Daniel continued, voice slower now, but powerful. For decades, families in Riverbend were robbed of their homes, their dignity, their safety. Those in power believed no one would ever challenge them. He glanced at Anita. But they were wrong. Reporters scribbled furiously, phones lit up with real-time notifications, and across the nation, in living rooms, classrooms, churches, and barber shops, people watched. Some in anger, some are in grief, some are in long-awaited relief. And let me be clear, Daniel said, meeting the camera's gaze like he was speaking to every person in America. This isn't just a Riverbend problem. This is an American problem. A reminder of how racism hides in paperwork, in policy, in polite smiles that conceal rotten roots. He steadied himself against the bed rail. But if injustice can spread, he said softly, so can courage. And then the recorder ended, a beat of silence. Then reporters erupted, voices overlapping in a tidal wave of questions. But the cameras didn't stay on Daniel, because through the window behind him, the world saw something else. Federal agents marched out of City Hall with Mayor Jensen in handcuffs. Chief Daley next, then Rickman, then Hardy, then the clerks, then the developers. One by one, the entire corrupt network is collapsing in the glare of justice. A nurse whispered, "My God." Anita covered her mouth, tears forming. Corey's live stream, already viral, caught every arrest. People in Riverbend stepped onto their porches, watching the procession through town. Some prayed, some wept, some held their children close. They had seen injustice. Now they were seeing justice, and they knew the difference. Daniel leaned back, suddenly exhausted. The handcuffs on his wrist felt lighter somehow, symbolic, no longer threatening. He had beaten them, not by running, not by fighting in the dark, but by telling the truth in the light. And in that moment, America understood. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a reckoning, restoration, renewal, and the America we choose to build. The late summer sun burned brightly over Riverbend, gilding the courthouse steps in warm, defiant light. It was a day the town had waited generations for. A day many feared would never come. A day when truth not only rose, but stood tall. Dr. Daniel Carter adjusted his brown trench coat, the familiar weight steadying him despite the stitches, the bruised ribs, the lingering ache in his arm. The coat, torn, blood-stained, weathered, had become a symbol, not of authority, but of survival. Around him a crowd gathered, black families who'd fought for decades to keep the homes their ancestors built. Elderly neighbors who had witnessed injustice in silence, believing speaking up would cost them everything. Young adults who had carried fear like a second skin. Children who, for the first time, could run across front lawns without their parents scanning the street in suspicion. Handmade signs rose above the sea of faces. Justice lives here. Homes are sacred, never again. We stand together. Federal agents moved in and out of City Hall, carting out boxes of confiscated records, computers, hard drives, files that documented years of corruption. Now evidence in the largest civil rights investigation the region had ever seen. Beside Daniel, Mrs. Harris dabbed her eyes with a trembling handkerchief. "I lived long enough to see justice walk out that door," she said, nodding at the agents escorting former Chief Daley into a waiting vehicle. I never thought I'd see this." Daniel gently squeezed her shoulder. "You earned this moment. All of you did. Your strength carried us forward." She sniffed. "Baby, we were strong because you reminded us we could be." A ripple of cheers rose from the crowd as another official emerged in handcuffs. A councilman who had profited off the displacement of dozens of black families. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. For once, the powerful weren't protected by silence. Today, silence had turned into testimonies. Fear had turned into fire, and fire had turned into change. Anita Rhodes approached, sunlight glinting off her newly restored council pin. She carried a thick stack of documents, the first wave of restored property deeds. 23 families received theirs this morning, she said, unable to hide her smile. And this, she held up a second stack. This is just the beginning. The crowd cheered. A young father lifted his daughter into the air. Baby, he whispered, his voice breaking. We got our home back. Daniel felt the sound echo through his chest. A sound that was more than joy. It was reclamation. A piece of soul returned. A wound beginning to close. Corey Johnson pushed through the crowd next. A new press badge hung around his neck, bearing the logo of a national newspaper. His eyes shone with a mix of awe, exhaustion, and pride. They're broadcasting live across the country, Corey said. Your press conference, the arrests, the testimonies, America's watching, and they're listening. Good, Daniel replied softly. It's time they did. The transfer of power began quietly, but the crowd felt it like thunder. A line of federal officials approached with boxes of training manuals, community policy guidelines, and updated oversight procedures. The FBI was launching a pilot reform program in Riverbend, one designed to rebuild trust, shift power, and ensure the kind of corruption that festered here could never take root again. Dr. Carter, one official called out, the Attorney General sends his gratitude. He expects you in Washington next week to discuss national expansion. Daniel nodded, though his gaze drifted not to Washington, but to the people of Riverbend. This wasn't about titles or positions of power. This was about home, about safety, about dignity, about belonging. Then came the moment no one expected. Anita climbed the courthouse podium steps and lifted a large, ornate key, gold, old, and symbolic. A hush fell over the crowd. This key, she began, her voice carrying with the clarity of a bell, once represented power held over us, used to open the doors of corruption and close the doors of justice. She took a breath, scanning the faces before her. But today we reclaim what was taken. Today this key becomes a symbol of something new: truth, community, and the promise that no voice will be silenced again. She turned to Daniel. Dr. Daniel Carter, you didn't just expose wrongdoing. You reminded us of our worth. You reminded us that standing together can rewrite the future. You gave us back our courage when we were told courage was dangerous. Her voice cracked with emotion. This key belongs to you. The crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel stepped forward, accepting the key with his good hand. It glowed in the sunlight, reflecting not just gold, but hope, purified, hard-earned hope. He turned toward the people, his people, and held the key high. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was gratitude, responsibility, and the weight of a town's rebirth, a symbol of doors once locked, now opening for everyone. The celebration that followed lasted long into the afternoon. Music floated through the streets, Motown classics, gospel, old blues records someone found in a dusty attic. Families danced. Children ran barefoot across freshly trimmed lawns. Long tables lined the streets, covered in barbecue, collard greens, cornbread, and peach cobbler made by women whose recipes were older than memory. Laughter, warm and unrestrained, echoed through the neighborhood. On Mrs. Harris's porch, Daniel sat while children peppered him with questions. Did you really chase the bad guys? Were you scared? Can I be FBI too? Daniel smiled gently. You can be anything, but being someone who brings justice and kindness into the world, that's the greatest job of all. Mrs. Harris watched him with soft eyes. Our community just needed a reminder, she said, that we could rise, that we deserve better. Everyone deserves better, Daniel said. That's the lesson. Down the street, Anita organized volunteers to set up the new youth leadership tent. A banner hung above it, the Carter Fellowship. Building leaders for a better America 10, full scholarships, mentorships, programs to teach civic engagement, history, responsibility, and pride. The first class gathered in front of the banner, teenagers who had grown up witnessing injustice, now stepping into a future shaped by empowerment. As the sun dipped low, the atmosphere shifted into something softer. Daniel stood on his porch steps, his trench coat draped over the railing. He looked out at the street, at neighbors who had once lived behind drawn curtains now talking freely, at families rebuilding broken homes, at a town reclaiming its heartbeat. Fireflies flickered in the dusk. Laughter drifted in warm waves. Music carried gently on the breeze. For the first time in decades, Riverbend felt alive. Not perfect, not finished, but healing. And healing is a kind of victory, a quiet one, but powerful. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle around him like a blanket. Justice wasn't just about putting corrupt officials in handcuffs. It was about restoring what had been lost. Homes, hope, community, faith in one another. And more than anything, it was about choosing love over fear. This was what America could be, what America should be, what America becomes when people stand together and refuse to let darkness define them. As stars appeared overhead, Daniel whispered to himself, "We are stronger together, always." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Moral lesson as the ending narration. Racism steals, corruption destroys, fear divides, but courage, collective courage, can break any chain. Let this story remind us that no community is too small, no injustice too old, no wound too deep to be healed by truth, unity, and love. We build a stronger America when we choose to uplift instead of tear down, when we protect rather than pray, when we fight not just for ourselves but for one another. Celebrate each other's humanity, stand against discrimination, choose compassion, choose justice, choose love, And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of what America can be, please subscribe to Racial Truth and continue this journey with us. Together, we can write a future our children will be proud to inherit. A lesson for all of us, a future for all of us. In the end, this story isn't just about one man. It isn't just about one town, one police department, or one moment of courage. It's about us, all of us. It's about the America we choose to build every single day, through our actions, our voices, our compassion, and the way we stand up for one another when injustice tries to divide us. Because the truth is simple, racism breaks communities, but unity rebuilds them. Fear destroys, but love restores. And when ordinary people come together, neighbors, elders, young people, families, when they choose courage over silence, hope over despair, and solidarity over isolation, miracles happen. Homes are reclaimed, voices are heard, justice rises, and a town once fractured becomes whole again. Let this story remind us that every one of us has a role in shaping a stronger America. Not an America built on the suffering of the vulnerable, but an America built on dignity, on fairness, on compassion, on the unshakable belief that every child, every family, every community deserves protection and respect. So hold each other close, speak up when it's hard, stand together when it matters most, and never forget, we rise higher when we rise together. If this story moved you, if it opened your heart, if it reminded you of what justice, love, and community truly look like, please subscribe to the Racial Truth YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that heal, enlighten, and inspire. Visit the channel, explore the videos, share them with friends and family. Let these stories spark conversations, the kind that bring people closer, the kind that change the world one heart at a time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. And thank you for choosing love, truth, and unity. Together, we can build the America our children deserve. Together, we are unstoppable.